The Kurokumo Clan. This faction has been a bleed-spamming menace in Project Moon games ever since Library of Ruina. In the olden days of Limbus Company, a much simpler time, the identities belonging to the clan were seen as a force to be reckoned with. But as time went on, and stronger and more complex identities were added to the game, and to the Bleed team specifically, the backstreets dwelling syndicate soldiers started falling out of the meta one by one, until none were left. Now, normally, this would mark the end of an outdated faction. They were replaced by newer and stronger alternatives, and have been put to rest forever. This is power creep, a phenomenon present in most, if not all, gacha games, and it was to be expected. And yet, the rerun of the Yield My Flesh to Claim Their Bones event has brought light to the darkness that enveloped the Kurokumo Clan, in the form of two brand new identities that promise to reinvent the power of the beloved syndicate by providing the older identities with some much needed support. Of course, such an idea piqued the interest of many players. But one question appeared in everyone's mind: can they really do it? In today's video I want to answer that question, and to do that we will need to take a look at a couple of things. First, I want you all to be familiar with what the old Kurokumo identities do. Don't worry, I won't be reading out all of their skills like I usually do. Instead, we'll just look at their most important abilities and what they bring to the team. After that, we will go over the newly available full Kurokumo Clan team, and we'll see if using that team is a good idea. And with that out of the way, we will be able to take a look at how you can include the Kurokumo identities into your team without overhauling it completely, in order to create the strongest bleed stacking squad in the entirety of Limbus Company. So if you want to see that, you'll definitely have to stay until the end. Also, real quick, before we start, the channel is even closer to 10k subscribers than when I released my last video, but a lot of my viewers are still not subscribed. So, if you find yourself coming back to my videos or end up enjoying this one, consider taking 1 second to subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Without further ado, let's get back to our syndicate. To start, let's look at all the old Kurokumo IDs and get acquainted with what they do. If you're not familiar with the new identities, I have a video on them that you might want to check out. The first unit we'll look at is Kurokumo Clan Wakashu Ryoshu. Her main claim to fame is her ability to inflict a ton of bleed count. Both her second and third skill inflict 3 bleed count, which is actually really good. In this one task, Ryoshu performs better than Rin Otis and pretty much on par with Rin Yisang, unless he gets lucky. Ryoshu also provides the team with 2 rare debuffs, Damage Down and Paralyze. These effects not only have the ability to drastically weaken the enemy, but also increase the damage of Heathcliff's third skill and Ishmael's entire kit, through their conditionals. She also has offense level down, but so do most Kurokumo identities, so the 2 rare debuffs matter a bit more. As an added bonus, Ryoshu has Gluttony on her skill 1. This allows her to fuel certain eagle skills in between inflicting lots of bleed count. As you could probably guess after one look at her kit, Kurokumo Clan Wakashu Ryoshu is an identity designed to inflict a ton of bleed count and potent debuffs, which makes her a decent pick for boss fights even without taking her Kurokumo synergy into consideration. However, her strengths matter a lot less in human encounters, and without high damage or even strong clashes to fall back on, if the fight becomes more focused on physical damage, Ryoshu becomes much less impactful in that type of content. Still, with Dark Cloud helping her out, Ryoshu can consistently keep up a bleed stack like no other identity, and her low clash power becomes much less noticeable when all her coins are unbreakable. Additionally, she gets a last defensive skill, which can help out with proccing passives if Ryoshu has no beta buttons to press. All of this makes her an identity that synergizes with the new Kurokumos very well, and in my eyes, Ryoshu is definitely a powerful identity, and I would go as far as to call her the best unit out of the old Kurokumo squad. Next up, we have Kurokumo Wakashu Honglu, another juggernaut of Season 1 Limbus Company. And in complete contrast to Roshu, Honglu mainly focuses on inflicting bleed potency, not count. His second skill inflicts 6 bleed if it gets its rerolls, and his third skill also inflicts 6 bleed as long as the 2 coins land on heads. Outside of the bleed potency infliction, however, Honglu doesn't do that much. His damage output is low, with maybe the exception of a Cloud Cutter getting its rerolls and flipping all heads. And the only other effect he inflicts is Paralyze on his skill 3. And to be fair, 6 stacks of Paralyze completely shut down any nuke skill the enemy might throw at you, but that's about the extent of his own value. But with Dark Cloud up, Honglu actually becomes a bleed demon. His second skill gets insane value from Dark Cloud, as it inflicts 4 individual instances of bleed, meaning you get 4 free bleed potency from using Cloud Cutter with Dark Cloud up. Add his passive to that, and you've got yourself a skill that casually inflicts 13 bleed. And Honglu has 2 of those. His third skill also uses the effect quite well, with its bleed infliction going from 6 to 8. Honglu's first skill inflicts a decent amount of bleed as well, and also has Last Affinity, meaning it can be used to help create Last Resonance chains without being forced to defend, which is a nice bonus. However, as much as I enjoy glazing the effect numbers on this identity, Honglu's kit is still plagued by weaknesses. For one, he has pretty much no clash power. The power of his skills in a clash never reaches above 13, which is lower than what most new IDs get on their skill 1 with conditionals. For offense level modifiers, Honglu's got zeros all around. This further kills his clash power, but also means that even that perfect Cloud Cutter will often deal next to no damage. Realistically, you only use Kurokumo Wakashu Honglu for his bleed, and pretty much nothing else. But you know, sometimes that's enough, especially with bleed potency infliction like his. The impact this unit makes on the bleed stack does not go unnoticed, even if he deals no physical damage alongside it. Our next ID is Kurokumo Clan Captain Gregor, and this identity was released in Season 3, and he's a clan captain, just like Ishmael. Surely an identity in such a position would be a powerful unit. Well, fuck me, the man's a 2-star. Unlike both Roshu and Honglu, Gregor does not contribute that much to the bleed stack. Instead, he uses an existing bleed stack to fulfill his coin conditionals, which allow him to inflict a bunch of potent offensive debuffs. His second skill inflicts 1 offense level down and 1 attack power down, while his third skill inflicts 4 offense level down and 1 plus coin drop. These effects, plus coin drop in particular, are powerful tools that keep your enemies in check, making Gregor's debuff infliction at least slightly notable. But I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to make you think he's a good identity. While it's true that Gregor's power is actually serviceable, all he has going for him is exactly that and plus coin drop. And the funny part is the fact that Dark Cloud is specifically designed as an effect that allows your units to lose clashes and still hit the enemy, meaning that not only does Gregor not get the value of the effect due to not inflicting much bleed, but his own abilities also become less valuable, as the team does not need to debuff the enemy into the ground to win. But Gregor is still a serviceable identity if you are a new player, as unlike Roshu and Honglu, he gets power conditionals that make him decent at clashing, and his requirements for the debuffs can be pretty easily fulfilled even without a bleed stack focused team. He's not exactly a priority pick for making the most out of the Kurokumo synergies, but he's a decent identity for plugging a hole in your bleed team until you find a better alternative. Also, he's good at making last resonances, so there's that. And our final identity for the clan is Kurokumo Clan Wakashu Rodion. Rodia's ID tries to combine poise and bleed in her kit, which is something that can work if we look at some other Blois identities. And, well, although it can work on paper, if we look at her skills closely, we'll see that it's not that simple. First off, her poise. While her poise potency generation is decent, the only ways Rodion can get poise count is through her skill 2 and counter. This is not enough to maintain a poise stack. But why does she even need poise? Well, if we look at her bleed infliction, we'll see that Rodion inflicts a fair bit of bleed with her second skill, and a whopping 10 bleed with her third. But, of course, there's a catch. Sky Clearing Cut only inflicts bleed on crit, meaning you have to use her skill 2 or counter before using her skill 3, and then hope it crits for the bleed. Now, the crit chance is doubled if the enemy has 6 or more bleed, once again making it better against bosses, but even then, after one skill 2, the chance is capped at 60%, meaning you'll have to go for another skill 2, which you might not get, so you can get the chance to 100%. And if you can pull that off, mostly by getting lucky with the skill sequence or the 60% crit, you're rewarded with a lot of bleed potency. But this is where I come in with an opinion I have after testing her out. She's insanely inconsistent. There are a lot of moving parts to her perfect combo, and hitting it in an actual fight in a timely manner requires a lot of rerolling. But honestly, there's no point in talking about her forever. She's not very consistent, but her potency infliction can be good. But it's still worse than Honglu's. Her third skill clashes well, but she doesn't really help with last chains, and she isn't that good overall. And now that we've talked about every Kurokumo ID, and you know what they all do, we can move on to the team building segment, and the first team we'll talk about is the full Kurokumo team. First of all, why would you want to build a full team of these identities? Well, besides them looking cool, there actually are two abilities that require a full Kurokumo team. Both of those abilities are on Ishmael's skill 2, Sharpened Blade. Its combat start effect goes from 2 damage up on 2 allies to 4 damage up on 5 allies, which is honestly quite incredible. On the same skill, the effect of the first coin goes from inflicting 1/ fragility to inflicting 2 fragile, which is obviously more damage, but it also allows non/IDs to take advantage of the effect while contributing another stack towards Ishmael's damage conditionals as well. Right off the bat, the team is mostly built to beat bosses. This is because bleed is an inherently boss-killing status effect, and this team stacks a lot of bleed. And when I say a lot of bleed, I mean it. While the Blood Fiends defy everything bleed stands for and basically use it as charge for their big attacks, the Kurokumo Clan gets a tremendous amount of both potency and count infliction. This allows the team to show consistent results on any boss regardless of their resistances, as Bleed's true damage will do most of the heavy lifting for this comp. However, such power does not come without a cost. Over the course of the ID overview segment, I've said again and again that the Kurokumo identities tend to lack power and damage. This problem becomes much more severe when 4 out of 6 identities on the team clash like they're fighting with one hand. And because of this, you will find yourself losing clashes quite often. But of course, Project Moon have thought of that, and have provided the team with a lifeline in the form of the Dark Cloud effect. This is where we get into the real reason for why you would run a full Kurokumo team, and the way you want to play it. Now, I've talked about Dark Cloud already in my guide to Heathcliff and Ishmael, but there's no harm in going over the effect again. Dark Cloud allows the allies it is applied to inflict 1 more bleed potency and count with their skills, while also making all of their coins unbreakable, giving them final power on Clash Lose, and giving them stagger immunity until their skill ends. This effect is pretty obviously awesome, as it allows your Kurokumo identities to provide the value of their high bleed infliction numbers while not being forced to try and win clashes with their abhorrent power values. Now, the smart people among my viewers might say that you could always hit the enemy with one-sided attacks, so winning clashes was never a requirement. But in reality, the main advantage this effect provides isn't even the fact that all coins turn unbreakable, and instead it's the stagger immunity until skill end. With this, not only do Kurokumo units get to inflict their effects through lost clashes, but they also do it through damage that normally would have staggered them. This blocks out any attempt by the enemies to stop the inevitable wave of blood, which makes using this team of underpowered IDs a lot easier. As for how to use it, there are mainly two things you want to keep in mind. First is the fact that Dark Cloud is only applied to allies whenever there is a triple Last Resonance on the board. However, in that case, the effect only hits the allies adjacent to Ishmael, meaning to get the full value of this effect buffing the whole team, you're pretty much forced to play around 4 skill Last Resonances. Luckily, the team is pretty decent at making Last Resonances, as a lot of the identities have a Last Defense, and all of them have one Last skill. However, it's not as simple as making a resonance every turn by default, as you should be prepared to oftentimes weave in entirely lastless turns into your fight. When doing this, you should check every clash or unopposed attack you're taking to make sure none of your identities will suddenly implode. As long as you do this, the survivability of the team will remain decently high, which is kind of surprising, considering their whole lose clashes to win mechanic. Another thing you should keep your eye on is Honglu's second skill. It deals good damage and can inflict an insane amount of bleed potency, but it requires you to manage your bleed stack well. Against bosses with a lot of coins, this should not be a problem, as you won't find yourself making impenetrable bleed stacks too often. However, on bosses that take less actions per turn, you might be forced to restart to get Cloud Cutter earlier, before you stack bleed up too high. However, somewhere in the middle ground, you should be using Ishmael's third skill to create a mini deluge and get rid of an additional stack of bleed count to help out Honglu. Also, if he isn't the first unit acting in a turn, don't forget to force clashes with your faster identities to draw out the enemy's coins earlier, thus also lowering their bleed count. Some might say Cloud Cutter has a clear anti-synergy with the idea of bleed, but I believe that outside of mirror dungeons, you can very often impact the stack in such a way that Honglu gets his rerolls with decent consistency. Now, is the team good and should you use it? No, god no. It's far worse than combining Kurokumo with Bloodfiends, and it's even worse than using no Kurokumos in most scenarios. The main good thing about this team is that it does not care about the boss's resistances, making it a decent pick against bosses with really high physical defenses. But even then, the overtuned Bloodfiends can brute force their way through those, and the inflated HP numbers on most late game bosses render bleed a less desirable way to deal good damage to them than in Library of Ruina. And before we move on to how I recommend using the Kurokumo subtype, let's take a look at the idea of sacrificing your units for the battle ready effect. This idea stems from the fact that Ishmael and Heathcliff both have the battle ready passive, which buffs them greatly once 3 other Kurokumo allies have died. And while it's true that due to chain battles being the norm now, you can easily sacrifice a couple of level 1 Kurokumo soldiers, there are some catches. The main one is identity overlap. If you look closely at the sinners that have Kurokumo Clan identities, you'll see that they also have other variants useful for the bleed team. And while Ryoshu and Honglu might not have the highest priority identities for this team, Gregor and Rodya can also be Bloodfiends. And not just ordinary replaceable Bloodfiends, but ones essential to the team. If you want to get the battle ready effect and then transition to a more traditional Bloodfiend team, you will see that you are forced to make the team slightly weaker than normal. Now, to be fair, I believe that you can give up Gregor or Rodion without suffering major consequences in certain encounters, but the effect you get in return is not nearly as useful as having both of them on your team. In addition to that, you delay the early SP gain of the units that sub in by 1 or more turns, which also results in a larger negative side to this trade-off. Overall, I would not recommend going for sacrifices with this team, and I'd say you should treat the battle-ready passives as power increases for your strongest Kurokumo identities when something goes south in a full Kurokumo squad. And now, finally, how can we put the Syndicate into our bleed team so that we get the most value for the least amount of value lost? Well, there are two ways that can be done, and we'll look at both. The first way is by putting just two identities into our team, which are obviously Ishmael and Heathcliff. The two newest IDs, the ones that don't require any crutches, and the ones that work well regardless of the surrounding composition. By putting these two units into your bleed team, you improve your squad's ability to inflict bleed, as both IDs get +2 count on their second skill, and in Heathcliff's case, he also gets a lot of bleed potency infliction on his third skill and counter. These units also make Pride much more common in bleed, allowing for Pride Resonance to be used with some consistency. In return, adding them to your roster, without taking away any meta Bloodfiends, greatly reduces the amount of gluttony the team generates. This makes the bleed team a tad bit worse on human encounters, as spamming Yearning Merkala Dawn becomes impossible, and even using the skill once requires forcing Gregor to focus on using his skill 1 over any other skill. Another concept these two units add to bleed is slash damage, which notably only got dealt by the one who shall not be named, and was absent in the kits of all the meta Bloodfiends. The usefulness of this fact depends entirely on who you're fighting, as in some cases it can be a nice bonus, while in others it might be detrimental. All in all, using these two identities makes the team better against bosses, as Yearning Merkala Dawn isn't as useful in those encounters, and the bleed and offensive debuff infliction really shines when fighting one enemy. It's true that the Kurokumos have to compete with Armor Salt and Ring Otis, both of whom are better at maintaining bleed count. But if you aren't planning on consciously stacking bleed, getting Heath and Ishmael to inflict some debuffs and deal good damage is also an option, and can be considered a side grade to the normal anti-boss bleed composition. The other way to weave in Kurokumos into your team is putting 3 of them into your squad. This allows you to get more value out of Ishmael's passive and second skill, while further moving the team towards being a boss killer. By sacrificing Gregor to put in Kurokumo Ryoshu alongside the previously discussed duo, you get a team that can easily create lots of last resonance, stack bleed and also win clashes. With both Dawn and Ryoya's clashable counters, you get access to 2 last skills that generate bleed count and can be used at any time. Combine this with the abundance of other last skills on the team, and you'll find yourself making more last resonance chains than in the full Kurokumo squad. The resonances help empower Ryoshu, who can now easily dish out 11 to 12 count in 3 turns with a good enough skill sequence, and the bleed potency infliction gets taken care of by Heathcliff and Don's La Sangre de Sancho. Once again, this team performs well on bosses, as you get your max conditionals easily and can utilize the bleed stack as a potent source of damage. In fact, the bleed damage here can actually outdamage the normal anti-boss squad, and Gregor isn't even necessary, as his Bloodfist generation gets substituted by the large bleed stack on the enemy. The main thing you're missing out on is Mersault's Yearning Merkala Ego, as well as his incredible bleed infliction after his setup, which makes him a better unit than Ryoshu in longer encounters. But for quick bleed stacking shenanigans, the triple Kurokumo team can work, making it a decent side grade to the already existing bleed team. And so, to come to a conclusion in this unnecessarily long video, should you use the Kurokumo Clan? Well, I'd say it's an option that definitely exists now, and simply saying that the Kurokumo IDs are too weak to ever be used is no longer true. However, I want to say the same thing I said in the last video. The new identities and the revived subtype could never be better than the Bloodfiends, as that faction has the newest seasonal ID that's incredibly overtuned. The best the team can hope for is becoming an alternate option to the existing Bleed team, providing a more effect-focused approach to an archetype that has been reduced to Anga Banga during Season 5. And if that is what you expected, that's exactly what you got. The Kurokumo IDs, both new and old, are now options that you should keep in mind when making a Bleed team for an encounter. Is the enemy /weak? Use Ishmael and Heathcliff instead of Ring Otis and Armor Salt. Does the enemy boss have tremendous resistances to Pierce and Lust? Well, if you don't want to swap to a different team, you can go for the triple Kurokumo approach and try to play for the Bleed stack to kill the enemy with true damage. It's not better than other options, but the Kurokumo subtype is a side grade that can be used to maximize the versatility of the Bleed squad. But should you shard them? No, get Bloodfiends instead, they're simply stronger. And well, that's it. If you disagree or have something to add, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'll definitely read all of them, and if I end up being very wrong, we'll come back to this topic. If you enjoyed the video at any point, leave a like to let me know, and if you want to see more videos like this, check out the rest of my channel, and consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.